Okay, here we are again. And for the second part of this lecture, I think we can, we'll try to talk a bit till about a quarter, 20 to 1 at the latest. And then we have space for questions and answers time. Okay, in this second part, I'm going to frame. It's a kind of a game of frames in which we can conceptualize sustainability. Sustainability, as you know, is a very common sense, very popular word, but its meaning is in a certain way done lost. And we'll try to make sense of a general frame in which we can rethink it, redesign it accordingly to the scenarios we are living in. The first frame is the frame of hyper-citizenship, of course. I already mentioned it to you, but I never explained it to you for real. And so we'll briefly do that. Hyper-citizens are not necessarily people. We are talking about a model, a governance and policy model. It means that hyper-citizen can be an organization, hyper-citizen can be a law, can be a policy model, can be also a person, but not necessary. Can be a treaty, and can also be an item, a thing. What are the features of hyper-citizenship? They are basically four. The first one is cosmopolitanism. The matter that it very often happens that radicalization of identity takes shape, but it happens in very rough social dynamics, which normally lead to social, political, and sometimes also military conflict. But the most effective remedy against the radicalization of identity is to remember that human condition is a cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitanism is not a goal, is not a value, is something we are in since we were in the caverns. You know, the first Homo sapiens moved, or even before the sapiens, moved from Africa to Europe. And it was not the time with no writing and no culture in the meaning we use today. Cosmopolitanism is what explains to, for example, to a very old-fashioned traditionalist Austrian that the typical Austrian cake, the Sachertorte, would have been impossible without the Queen of Spain, Isabella of Castilla, without Christopher Columbus, without the Native Americans cultivating cocoa, without the Dutch and the Bavarian specialists in pastries and cakes, who transformed a rather spicy thing, as cocoa was in its origin. It was a spicy root in the origin, and it was turned in a kind of a brown, sweet dust. So when you think typical Austrian, you are talking about Spain, Italy, the Native Americans, the Bavarians, and the Dutch. So wherever you search for something typical, something national, you don't find it. Also the spaghetti alla pomarola, spaghetti with tomato, in a certain way, spaghetti came from China. not in its current shape, but the invention was Chinese. And once again, tomato without Columbus, without the Queen of Spain, without the Native Americans, forget about it. So you need the China and the Americas to have the typical Mediterranean pasta and tomato. So cosmopolitanism is the first aspect of hyper-citizenship. The second aspect, the second dimension, is to be science-based. It doesn't mean that science explains everything, but it means that every citizen, an organization, a party, an enterprise, an NGO, whatever, a state, and the person itself, or to be able to participate actively in the social, political, economical life needs to have a stronger education in science than in the past. We talk about the pandemic, we talk about ecology, we talk about a different way to give birth to children. Most of the political debate is currently based on scientific topics. Is nuclear energy good or bad? Do renewable energies effectively work? These are not questions that you can answer according to a left or right coding. It's a matter of scientific research. So also the average citizen is required to get a huge amount of science-based information, much more than in the past. The third dimension of hyper-citizenship is what we call the entrepreneurial citizenship. Of course, not everybody is talented and gifted to become an entrepreneur in the most specific meaning of the word, of the term. Nevertheless, in our kind of society, an entrepreneurial spirit doesn't mean that you will be an entrepreneur properly talking, but simply that you will need to be a kind of entrepreneur of yourself, because in our age, you are required in a certain way to design yourself and to construct yourself. Normally, through the centuries, society gave your position, your social position, in the moment of your birth. In the stratified societies, if you were the son of a duke, you would have been a very important person in society, becoming the duke after your father's death. But at the same time, if you are the duke, you already know that becoming the emperor is not for you. At the same time, if you are the duke, you already know you will never be poor and you will never be in the lowest classes of the society. In the tribal and feudal societies, it was even neater, even more evident. So society chose your position in its order since your moment of birth, since the moment of your birth. In our society, it isn't so. Also, education, with its limits, is a tool for social climbing, where social climbing in this case has no negative meaning. Simply, you try to educate yourself to be better, to be more successful according to the idea of life you have in mind. Okay? So, an entrepreneurial spirit is what I mean in these terms, not that everybody becomes an entrepreneur. Okay? Not everybody opens a limited company. Simply, entrepreneur in the meaning that you have to construct your own life with all the opportunities and all the threats you have to cope with. The fourth dimension, the fourth and last dimension of hypercitizenship is what we call social autonomy. The capability to create networks, to create social networks, not necessarily social media. Also, an NGO is a social network in a certain way. So the capability to transform civil society from something you just live in something you participate to organize according to expectations, according to goals, according to coordination of other people and organizations, which are not state and are not free market either. So these four dimensions shape hypercitizenship, which, as I told you, is not necessarily targeted on people, on physical people. An organization can be hypercitizen, a book can be hypercitizen, an investment can be hypercitizen, finance can be hypercitizen. If you take a look around the globe, most of the great investors are hypercitizens, so they often have 2-3 passports. They invest in almost every country on the planet. And normally they don't have strong allies and strong enemies. They are much softer because they deal with Chinese like with Arabs, with Germans like with Americans. Because networking is a key part of investing. And the more you become rigid in your investment strategy, the more you put your limits to yourself. So this is the general frame of the 4 pillars of hypercitizenship. And first of all, when we think about sustainability, we have to consider also sustainability according to these 4 dimensions. Then we have another aspect, another frame we use to understand the context of sustainability. State-centered policies, state-centered public policies are becoming more and more disasters. Also with pandemia, the matter is becoming much more evident because, for example, many European countries to deal with pandemia used lockdown, but lockdown, according to the German Prime Minister, the Chancellor, lockdown according to the Japanese Prime Minister, lockdown according to the Italian Prime Minister, lockdown according to the Belgian Prime Minister, were totally different things. So even if the noun, the word was the same, in conceptual, strategic, and managerial terms, these were very different things. And so it was practically impossible both to compare the effectiveness of these policies, of these lockdown policies, and even worse, it made more difficult the coordination of the pandemic management from the WHO. Medical intervention, strategic medical intervention, strongly in the case of pandemia, so a high-scale planetary phenomenon, requires global coordination. There is no local solution for global phenomena. There is no local solution to face and to solve a global scale problem. So local problem, local solution. Global problem, global solution. Of course, you don't need to organize a European Union referendum to change the broken light in the street around your block. You just need that the city manager hires a company to change the red light or the green light, whatever. You don't need to make a petition to the United Nations or the OECD. Just change the light in the streets. Okay. So what happened? That the state-centered solutions failed. Free market solution only failed. And at the same time, civil society solutions only, so the illusion that no profit could solve everything, failed. In this case, we can shape what later Stoff would have called a triple helix. And probably it can also be useful to understand the multi-stakeholder patterns. Because a triple helix is what normally allows you to interconnect public, not-for-profit, and market. But a triple helix, I can share some words with you in the next future if you like. Triple helix is not just to put things together. You need procedures, you need some systemic regulations. And of course, a triple helix of public sphere, market sphere, and not-for-profit sphere is pivotal to let sustainability be effective. But it is also very important to understand what the public sphere means by sustainability, what the market means by sustainability, and what civil society and non-profit mean by sustainability. Because sometimes, just like for the lockdown word, behind the same word, there are many different meanings. And it is one of the reasons why very often the United Nations goal setting doesn't work or works less effectively than expected. Because everybody agrees about a more sustainable world, but a more sustainable planet, but mostly different organizations have different visions of sustainability in their minds. One way, and this is the third and the last frame for today, one way to make sense if sustainability is really sustainable is to frame sustainability in the quadruple helix I told you, the last one in today's lecture, which is the quadruple helix I quoted at the end of the first part of this lecture. In this case, the four elements, the four dimensions of the quadruple helix cycle are demography, development, technology, and legislative expansion. Legislative expansion is probably the most interesting of the four dimensions according to the kind of doctoral program you are in. If I were lecturing in a doctoral program in innovation and technology, probably would have been focused more on the technology dimension. Of course, we have to keep all the four dimensions together. But in our talk today, probably the legislative expansion dimension is the most important for political scientists, historians, economists, and legal studies scholars. Development is let's start from the beginning. Demography. Demography is a variable everybody considers. But even about demography, there is total uncertainty. I will not make you a list of long list of references, but I can provide them to you in the next days if you wish. But there are two different visions stating that world population will explode. We will get up to 10 billion people on the planet at around 2050. And so population would be about 10 billion people and it would mean, according to these theories, the total collapse of the planet. The collapse because of the Malthus trap. Not enough resources, and so even if the ecological threat would be under control, social fights for food, social fights for water, social fights for housing would become so strong that our species would be in trouble in any way, independently from the ecological threat. Another vision states that after the death of the baby boomers of the North America generation, the baby boomers of the North American generation, baby boomers are the guys, the people born in North America, more or less in the second half of the 40s. These are the American baby boomers. And after the death of the European baby boomers, my generation, I'm 53 now, baby boomers in Europe are the guys born between 64 and 68, 69, more or less. After these two generations will disappear from the planet on the big numbers, of course, tendenzially the population on the planet would be so much reduced up to 5 billion people that probably most of the problems will be automatically solved. These are the two opposite visions, and they fight facing each other with statistics. But we already know that a statistic with its variables comes out from the way you conceptualize and classify the topic you are observing. Development is the most tricky, the trickiest of these four dimensions, because development means everything and nothing at the same time. It means everything because we understand that human life and life in general is evolutionary. There is no way to stand still. At the same time, the unexpected and consequent effects of development in one way or the other are sometimes tricky. In a certain way, the ecological problem we are facing now comes from the great speed up in our social organization began with the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution in a certain way began pollution, but at the same time, Industrial Revolution created the long-term problems maybe, but at the same time, it solved the threat of the Malthus trap. Mankind was going to jump in at the end of the 17th, or sorry, at the end of the 18th century. So Industrial Revolution allowed to multiply the quantity of food, for example, in a moment in which population was very much growing. The third dimension is technology. I will not go into much depth because technology is, simply considered on two levels. Incremental technology, little changes step by step, and reconfigurating technologies. Reconfigurating technologies are the ones which are really game changers. At the moment, for example, at the moment, not in the future, we are already ready to collect asteroids from the skies, from the atmosphere, and to import from some asteroids some minerals and other materials which could be important resources for our planet. At the same time, some geologists found out one more ocean on our planet, more or less in the depth of the Earth, of our planet, about 1,000 meters below our subsurface. And that water could be precious to skip the risk of lack of water on our planet, but still, we still don't have a technology to to get that water in such depth. The fourth dimension, which is the most relevant for you, is the legislative expansion. It can be a tricky topic because common sense might consider legislative expansion just the power of Parliament to make more and more laws, more and more norms, more and more regulations. It's not what I mean. It's not what I mean by legislative expansion. Legislative expansion, which is what I tried to simplify, talking in the first part about the European Parliament elections, is simply a change of scale in the setting of the legislative power. The lowest the level of legislative decision making, the less effective the power and the implementation of a policy. We are going to see the implementation of the so-called recovery plan after the pandemic, you know, developed by the European Union and managed by the states. In some countries, the prime ministers already stated that the true protagonists of the management of the resources of the recovery plan would be the city majors, which in a country like Italy is a bit suicidal because we have a huge amount, a gigantic amount of municipalities, which would mean an explosion of rules, an explosion of fragmentation, and a high level of contingency, which would make impossible the assessment, the standard assessment of the policy effectiveness, which we will have to demonstrate and to debate at the end of the recovery plan in Brussels. So legislative expansion is nowadays probably the most important dimension of the four I quoted in this cycle. And as I told you before, it's not just a matter of more production of law from the parliament. It's not what I mean. It's an increase of scale in the placing of the legislative power, and at the same time, an increase of leverage of the impact of the public governance and policy modeling. For the very important Spanish political scientist, Felix Ovejero, made an important distinction between a radical participative democracy and procedural deliberative democracy. Radical participative democracy normally belongs to small contexts in which still you can use perceptions, you can use emotions, you can use different energy and cognitive saving methods to make your decisions. But you cannot decide in emotional terms about exchanges. It would be like gambling. You can do that, but I mean, gambling would be safer, okay? And at the same time, he made a distinction between radical participation, as I told you, and deliberative procedural participation, which means that citizens, meant as individuals, but also as organizations, as parties, etc., belong to the voting machine, becoming a waiting machine. It means that in practice, the more the problem to face is complex, like sustainability, the more the problem is global, like sustainability, the more you need deliberative procedural participation, which means more educated, more informed, more science-based citizens. And on the other side, you need these citizens to vote on a much bigger scale. In that way, the voting machine would be more effective than the traditional voting machine to make sense of what citizens expect, desire, or are afraid of. So in practice, sustainability requires to be framed in these three frames, different frames as I told you, and requires to be considered also as a Trojan horse, so to speak, to rethink the leverage and scale of legislative expansion. Without this kind of legislative expansion, it's very hard to imagine a concrete problem solving in sustainability. And first of all, it would be almost impossible to give accountability of the sustainable politics and policies. If you want to account them, if you want to describe the return on investment to make a balance, you need standards, you need concepts, you need tools, which cannot be simply the expression of local political wills. I would stop here for this lecture time, and if you agree, we can start the question and answer times, and if you like, we can also try to link better the general topic I lectured about and your research works in progress for your doctoral program. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to the doctoral program of the Statale University of Milan and Professor Cominelli for the invitation. And so we can start our question time, if you agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
We can thank you, and we can stop the recording, of course.